A warm welcome, I want to say, at the beginning of this evening. I'm really happy to see you here on the Bonhoeffer Day. Today would be his birthday on 4th of February. And we are very happy as a congregation of the Bonhoeffer Church, but also as the congregations of London East, the German congregations, to welcome you here and also online. A special welcome to Eleanor McLaughlin and to Jacob Phillips. I will briefly introduce the both and then we proceed. It's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker this evening, Dr. Eleanor McLaughlin. Ali is a lecturer in theology at Ripon College, Capstan, and an associate member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford. Her research and teaching focus on doctrine and ethics, with particular interests in theological anthropology, disability theology, and of course, the life and thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. She's also a trustee of Project Bonhoeffer, a charity dedicated to engaging with Bonhoeffer's legacy today. Among her publications is her book Unconscious Christianity in Bonhoeffer's Late Theology, Encounters with the Unknown Christ, with features a foreword by Rowan Williams. This work explores Bonhoeffer's engagement with the presence of Christ beyond the boundaries of the visible church. We are very much looking forward to hearing her insight this evening. Please join me in welcoming her.
It's natural.
Yeah, that's been there all evening.
Yeah.
Can't switch it on.
Suddenly visible. Thank you so much, everyone, particularly to Sylvia and Max for inviting me this evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you on the occasion of the anniversary of Bonhoeffer's birthday. And it's a pleasure to be in this church, in this space with you, and having people join us online as well. I'm going to start by going back to a sermon that Bonhoeffer preached on Reformation Sunday in 1932. He preached on Revelation chapter 2, verses 4, 5, and 7, reminding the congregation of God's words to the church in Ephesus. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love that you had at first. Bonhoeffer called on his listeners to remember their love for God and for their neighbour, instead of focusing on other things like trying to be influential, making sure to be seen at the right events, or even other activities which we might see as being more worthwhile, like setting up a youth club for people in the community. Throughout the sermon, he repeatedly came back to the phrase, "Let God be God," and repeated the phrase from Revelation 2, verse 4, "You have abandoned the love you had at first." His message is in the sermon that we must love God, we must love our neighbour, and we must do the work that is set before us, that we can only see once we have fixed our hearts on God. The day Bonhoeffer preached this sermon, the country went to the polls, and the Nazi Party retained the highest number of votes cast, winning 33.1% of the votes. In his powerful sermon, Bonhoeffer questioned what he saw as the Protestant Church's complacency in the face of the rise of nationalism and its willingness to invoke God without loving God. He had a stark message for his church. If we do not love God, if we do not love our neighbor, God will turn to us and say, as was said to the church in Ephesus, "But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember then from where you have fallen, repent and do the works that you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent." In this extremely bleak warning, we get an early articulation of an idea that will remain a central feature in Bonhoeffer's theology. To be a Christian is to obey God's command to love God and to love our neighbor. To be a Christian is to look to God and, as he'll later put it in Discipleship, to respond to God's commands with simple obedience. This idea is still prominent when we get to his first ethics essay a few years down the line. In the essay Christ, Reality and Good, Bonhoeffer wrote that people who want to, quote, focus on the problem of a Christian ethic are faced with an outrageous demand. From the very outset, they must give up as inappropriate to this ethic the very two questions that led them to deal with the ethical problem. How can I be good? And how can I do something good? Instead, they must ask the wholly other, completely different question: what is the will of God? In other words, Bonhoeffer is trying to say that the only way to tackle the thorny question of Christian ethics is to orientate ourselves to discerning the will of God, being formed to Christ, as he'll also use that phrase, being formed to Christ, rather than casting around for an ethical principle or an isolated good deed. There are multiple other examples that we could look at here, but essentially what Bonhoeffer is saying is that Christians can and must look to God and keep God's commandment to love, and that in doing so, people will find a way through the tangle of life. Another of Bonhoeffer's early statements that is echoed in this early ethics essay. As we all know, Bonhoeffer was engaged from a very early date in resisting National Socialism in Germany. In 1933, he participated in the writing of the Bethel Confession, whose aim was to oppose the movement known as the German Christians, the Deutsche Christen, who sought to create a national church in line with Nazi values. During the process of drafting the confession, Bonhoeffer wrote to his grandmother, saying, "The real question is between Germanism and Christianity, and the sooner the conflict comes out into the open, the better." In his essay, Christ, Reality and Good, Bonhoeffer outlines what he calls 4 mandates: work, marriage, government, and the church. These mandates are given to humanity by God to prevent us from falling into chaos. We are meant to fulfill these mandates, or those into which we are called, in such a way as to reflect Jesus Christ. Each mandate, when fulfilled according to God's will, reflects Christ to others. However, Bonhoeffer recognizes that this, of course, isn't always the case. He writes, "In the concrete, persistent, arbitrary violation of this task, through concrete forms of work, marriage, government, and church. Persistent arbitrary violation of these tasks extinguishes the divine mandate." And he carries on developing this theme. Specific faults do not give the right to abolish or destroy what exists. Rather, they prompt a return to a true ordering under the divine mandate and a restoration of true responsibility for the divine task. Such true responsibility consists in aligning the concrete form of the divine mandates with their origin, existence, and goal in Jesus Christ. Now, this is a very complex idea that he's developing in this ethics essay, which I think is fascinating. But if you're just looking for one thing to take away, what becomes clear here is that for Bonhoeffer, all these 4 mandates, we're thinking particularly about government just right now, the origin and the existence and goal of these mandates is Jesus Christ. Thus, there can be no other legitimate goal, whether it is nationalism, what he refers to as Germanism, or anything else. This is a brief portrayal of some of the central ideas of Bonhoeffer's theology, but they give us enough of a basis on which to make some comments about the abuses of his thought in Christian nationalism. Essentially, if we're to think about Bonhoeffer's theology in relation to current political debates, I'm suggesting that some of the markers that we need to look for are: where do we see love of God and love of neighbour? And where do we see an orientation to and obedience to God? Let's hold those ideas in our minds as we progress. So why is it that so many people of opposing political groups and societal outlooks claim Bonhoeffer as the poster boy for their movement, sometimes literally? Everyone wants a piece of the Bonhoeffer cake. Partly he's an attractive figure because of his life and his theology, which can easily be mapped onto each other. We can say he talked the talk and he walked the walk. It's also true that the fragmentary nature of some of his writing makes it easier for any reader to pick through those fragments and create a text in their own image. But the fact that he is a complex author whose views evolved over time as he responded to his changing environment. And as Jacob will discuss later, he isn't someone that we can simply drop into our current political climate and immediately associate with one group or another. If we look at just a few of the facts about him, he's deeply socially conservative. He led an extremely privileged early life. He wrote radical theology. As a feminist, I would love to eradicate some of the things that he wrote about women and their role in society, but it's there in the texts and there's nothing I can do about it. If I'm looking at Bonhoeffer, I have to look at some views which I really find unhelpful. And I think that's where my deep misgivings about some of the uses of Bonhoeffer that we're seeing now arise. Because while people trying to be responsible interpreters of Bonhoeffer recognize that we have to deal with what Bonhoeffer has actually written, whether we like it or not, there are others who are happy to misrepresent him for their own devices. The Bonhoeffer scholar Charles Marsh, who is himself not without his critics, recently wrote, I'm quoting him, "On the religious right, a new generation of activist theocrats has convinced the rank and file that life under any democratic administration will become a Fourth Reich." Note the language. He's writing in an American context. They have turned Bonhoeffer into a political avatar. Who would not wish that a person we so greatly admire would have seen the world as we do? Except that Make America Great Again enthusiasts, such as author and radio personality Eric Metaxas, have transformed Bonhoeffer with little basis in fact, ignoring biographical features he doesn't like and inventing new parts he needs. Metaxas has recast Bonhoeffer's story as a battle cry for conservative Christian activism in every American presidential election since the first Obama administration. Let's cast our minds back to 2008. He goes to such an extreme as to suggest moral equivalence between the political assassination of an American Democrat with Bonhoeffer's involvement in the plot to kill Hitler. Marsh's take. It seems astonishing that Metaxas's deeply flawed interpretation of Bonhoeffer has gained so much ground, but on the other hand, we can see how tempting such a portrayal might be for someone with a clear nationalist agenda. Because of the 1984-esque rhetoric that has portrayed US liberals as Nazis, we can talk about that later, Christian nationalists can use Bonhoeffer's anti-Nazi stance and his death at the hands of that regime to their own ends. They can portray their resistance against the liberal federal government as parallel to Bonhoeffer's resistance against the Nazi government. As Bonhoeffer has become a figure of moral authority within popular theology, even those whose views are incompatible with Bonhoeffer's own seek to present him as supporting their cause, as this lends them theological and moral weight. The desire to appropriate Bonhoeffer in support of a theological argument can in fact be traced from very early scholarship to the present day. And I think it's worth just having a very quick overview of some of these appropriations so that we get a sense of what has already happened with his work. So if we look back to the 1950s, in the English language context, what we see is that many of Bonhoeffer's books had been published throughout the 1950s in English, but his theology came to greater prominence in the English-speaking world in 1963, when John A.T. Robinson used Letters and Papers from Prison as one of the 3 conversation partners in his own book, Honest to God. In fact, although it brought them into prominence in Britain, Robinson's account did not really do full justice to Bonhoeffer's ideas, as he advocates the idea of religionless Christianity for an increasingly secular society, but without explaining what Bonhoeffer means by religion. Concurrently, on the other side of the Atlantic, thinkers who became known as the Death of God theologians were drawing on Bonhoeffer's late theology to support their argument that, quote, there was once a God to whom adoration, praise, and trust were appropriate and even necessary, but that now there is no such God. The Death of God theologians emphasized Bonhoeffer's late writing on the world come of age and his idea that we must live in a world that he calls etsi deus non daretur, as if God were not a given. They did not, however, pay attention to Bonhoeffer's simultaneous and paradoxical claim that the world come of age is more godless and perhaps just because of that is closer to God than the world not yet come of age. Thus, the Death of God theologians miss a central point that Bonhoeffer makes about new possibilities for humanity's relationship with God in a world come of age. And so we can see a train already of misuse of Bonhoeffer's thinking. And the Death of God movement in particular shows that it's possible to read Bonhoeffer into different contexts and shape his work to fit a pre-existing agenda. Metaxas has gone a step further than the Death of God thinkers and has applied his pre-existing agenda to the entirety of Bonhoeffer's life and work. As Clifford Green acutely points out, Metaxas reads Bonhoeffer and his life story through the polarizing lens, which wishes to set conservative evangelicals against liberals. This lens allows Metaxas to compare Bonhoeffer with Trump, which he did in a Wall Street Journal article in 2016, urging Christians to vote for Trump in the upcoming presidential election. What's really interesting here is what exactly he does with Bonhoeffer. So this article was trying to alleviate the fears of many potential Trump voters who were disgusted at Trump's open, blatant misogyny. Metaxas writes, the anti-Nazi martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer also did things most Christians would say were disgusting. And by one simple sentence, manages to equate Trump with Bonhoeffer. That Bonhoeffer has been co-opted into an apologetic for a right-wing populist nationalist movement should remind us of another central element in Bonhoeffer's own theology. Theology should never be divorced from the real world. If theologians do not engage with the world and do not allow their theological thinking to be shaped by and in response to the reality around them, sharing insights and knowledge, it becomes easy for theological figures and ideas to be misunderstood and misrepresented. And I think it's important to say, as we observe this tide of Christian nationalism, and I'll end with this, that even well-meaning presentations of Bonhoeffer can be co-opted into a Christian nationalist agenda. The recent film, Bonhoeffer, Passed Us By Assassin, is a case in point. It may well have been a sincere effort at portraying Todd Komenicki's version of Bonhoeffer. He says he would have preferred to have the subtitle, My Bonhoeffer. It's his portrayal of the man, fair enough. But the fact that its US distributors, Angel Studios, promoted it on Instagram with the phrase, the battle against tyranny begins now, watch Bonhoeffer Passed Us By Assassin, shows how quickly it was subverted to a Christian nationalist agenda. The fact that in the poster, Bonhoeffer has a gun in his hand incites violence and is a wholly inaccurate portrayal of Bonhoeffer. So while individuals may not be intending to participate in this Christian narrative, Christian nationalist narrative, it's essential that we try to understand how that narrative is being shaped and how we can try to represent Bonhoeffer and his theology as carefully and accurately as possible. The Church and the Academy must resist abuses of Bonhoeffer's life and thought. This is no delusion, but urgent and necessary resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie, for your thoughts, and I'm already looking forward to the talk afterwards. But now I turn to Jacob. Our second speaker is Dr. Jacob Phillips. Jacob completed his PhD on Dietrich Bonhoeffer at King's College London in 2015 and is currently Professor of Systematic Theology at St. Mary's University, Twickenham. He's the author of Human Subjectivity in the Theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, published by Bloomsbury, in which he explores Bonhoeffer's understanding of human personhood. Beyond academia, Jacob has been involved with the Bonhoeffer Center at the Bonhoeffer Church, which, of course, is hosting this event tonight. His work engages deeply with the intersection of theology, ethics, and contemporary challenges in interpreting Bonhoeffer's legacy. We are really delighted to have him with us at this evening, so please join me in welcoming him here.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words of introduction and indeed for the invitation. It's lovely to be here back in this wonderful building. I would imagine the interior is largely unchanged from when Bonhoeffer was here. So I'm a bit worried about what I'm going to say tonight, but I'm going to say it anyway. I am going to touch on some sensitive issues to do with the current situation in the States. So I'll give you a quick, what we call a trigger warning. I tried to put all the really annoying and sensitive stuff at the beginning. So if you can bear with me for the first 10 minutes, it'll be okay after that. But I was thinking on the way here, I remember someone said to me a couple of years ago that if ever in an argument, one person accuses the other person of being a Nazi, it means they've lost the argument. And I think that's basically what I want to say, but I'm going to say it in more detail over 20 minutes. After I was asked to contribute to this evening's discussion, I started reading a book about the interwar writer Hilaire Belloc. It begins like this. There is no art by which a dead man may be so presented to the living that those who knew him will seem to have seen him once more as he was, and those who did not know him will receive the full effect of his personality. A portrait or bust may give posterity to his image. Perhaps a writer will describe him so persuasively that the sleeping memories of his friends are awakened as though by magic. But nothing can bring back the whole man, the full man, the living man. Now that writer is talking about resurrecting a deceased person's character, the full effect of his personality. There's something which is impossible to achieve. Surely this challenge is just as acute when it comes to trying to establish how someone would judge political issues which have emerged decades after their death. Establishing how someone might judge political events means not just looking at things the person has written and sort of proof texting by way of quotes you can connect with various issues, but trying to resurrect the full effect of their personality, that is, estimating how their ethical character would interpret today's contexts. Applying figures from the past to today's political issues is always ambiguous. But I want to start by mentioning two related reasons why it's difficult in the case of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and even Christian nationalism. In the first place, as we've heard in terms of its fragmentary character, Bonhoeffer's theology is notoriously difficult to characterize. If someone does a PhD on Bonhoeffer, I'd probably recommend they didn't now, but if they did, I wouldn't really. They'd have to sit down at some point and make their way through books that have been written about him. These might include Hanfried Müller's Von der Kirche zur Welt, published in English in 1961, which is written by an academic working under the auspices of the DDR, loyal to the administration, who considers Bonhoeffer's letters and papers to have reached a point of full alignment with Karl Marx by way of religious Christianity. Over here, of course, a few years later, we saw a similar misappropriation in John Robinson's Honest to God, as we've heard. Now, it's easy for us to scoff at these early misinterpreters of Bonhoeffer, but I think we could be a bit more charitable in some cases by recalling that Bonhoeffer himself is a man of uneasy tensions. Theologically speaking, this is shown by his steadfast allegiance to the radical and young theological school, originally called dialectical theology, associated with Karl Barth, on the one hand, which stands in an obvious tension with his close relationship with those seen as the old guard during the 1920s and 30s, who were the liberal Protestant establishment of Berlin, who formed him intellectually, like Adolf von Harnack. It's also shown in the strangely, almost conflicted feeling way in which he sometimes writes, like he's straining with all his might to bring together two apparently opposite concerns. These range from act and being, early in his work, to God and the world in his book Ethics. There are passages where it feels like he's trying to bring two things together, to give voice to an inarticulate sense of their unity, which he's still working out and hasn't quite established yet. Now, I'm not saying any of this is a criticism of Bonhoeffer. I'm just saying it lays his writing open to misunderstandings and at times wildly different interpretations. But the second point I want to make early on is about today's political scene, in which Christian nationalism is now an influential worldview in mainstream American politics. I've been to the States 8 times since 2010. On my first visit in that year, there was no indication of the troubles that were brewing. On my next 2 visits, I noticed the academic conferences I went to were deeply and all-encompassingly political, and it was quite a sudden change. Bonhoeffer was discussed in connection with his sexuality, often, with much speculation as to his friendship with Eberhard Bethge. People seem to have stopped exploring points of connection between Karl Barth and von Harnack and moved on to exploring links between Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King, Bonhoeffer and the queer theorist Michel Foucault, Bonhoeffer and black separatism in Malcolm X, or Bonhoeffer and the gender philosophy of Judith Butler. Since then, my visits to the States have seen more of a takeover of the culture wars. I was in Kansas in 2018 when Donald Trump was doing a rally. I was there for the Theology conference, not for the rally. But I wandered down to the auditorium to take a look at the crowd out of curiosity. On one side of the street were the pro-Trump people, with stalls selling badges and flags and signs about guns and freedom and the USA. On the other side, separated by police, were the anti-Trump protesters, mostly wearing black balaclavas and carrying flags with various insignia of different sexual or gender identities, and to my surprise, a huge number of hammer and sickle flags. But these were on black backgrounds rather than the traditional communist red. Whatever was going on, it just felt like a bizarre postmodern version of Weimar Berlin, and I didn't know what to make of it. I mention all this to make the point that not only is Bonhoeffer incredibly difficult to characterize, the culture wars are by definition prohibitive of nuanced and individual stances on things. Every issue becomes an identity marker, which falls sharply into one of 2 camps. In a society divided like this, or like that, I should say, about the USA, it's extremely difficult to be, say, anti-abortion and pro-carbon reduction, because each of those causes are linked in a web or cluster of adjacent causes. Similarly, it would be difficult for someone to say, favour the Civil Rights Act as a wonderful achievement, while also celebrating the Fifth Amendment about bearing arms. This is an example. I don't celebrate the Fifth Amendment. I'm saying how you can't hold these 2 things together. The list goes on, but my point is that nuance suffers when a war between opposing cultures exists side by side in one society. I think this is worth mentioning because, while of course Bonhoeffer would be utterly perplexed at his being co-opted by American Christian nationalists, Making him a cipher of resistance can mean making him a cipher of lots of other positions, which are perhaps not always so clear-cut. Take, for example, the statement made by actors of the Bonhoeffer movie, the recent one. Quote, "To us, the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer tells a tale about speaking up against totalitarian regimes and acting against systems of lies, bigotry, nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia." Now, I don't doubt for a moment that Bonhoeffer's life tells us much about challenging hateful attitudes of any kind in the name of Jesus Christ's witness to the love of God disclosed in the New Testament. But the contention today is what exactly constitutes a hateful attitude. This ambiguity is one of the drivers of the free speech issue that's given so much airtime in the media. Hateful speech, speech which incites violence or denigrates another's humanity, is obviously unacceptable and would be unacceptable to Bonhoeffer. But it's very difficult to apply a term like transphobia, even within that definition of what hateful speech is, and try and second guess how Bonhoeffer would respond to today's understanding of gender. And it's made as a passing remark with quite confident there. And I want to draw attention as to how that's quite a leap from what we have in Bonhoeffer's texts. Ambiguities about Bonhoeffer's legacy apply on both sides. One even more sensitive version of this point can be made with regard to the one issue which is always at play in American political life, and that's race relations. Bonhoeffer's involvement with the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem between 1930 and 31 is one of the most inspiring things about his life, a life with many inspiring things to choose from. I also think it seems to me incontrovertible that Bonhoeffer's first-hand experience of the poverty and oppression of African American people played an active role in his later resistance to Nazi anti-Semitism. In this respect, there's much I agree with wholeheartedly in a book by the American theologian Reggie Williams about the Harlem episode called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. However, Williams also utilizes the work of theologians like Millie Jennings, for whom white racial supremacy is endemic across all European cultures, and indeed is the defining feature of those cultures as European. Williams quotes Jennings' statement that European academic theology is a product of a, quote, diseased social imagination, suffering from a profound infection, which started where theology was merged with the colonial system to provide religious authority for centering the world on a European imagination, making Christ a white European man to offer an apologetics for imperial domination. I don't want to downplay the many terrible sins of colonialism, but just make a couple of observations here. Firstly, linking the influence of Bonhoeffer's Harlem experience with his Nazi resisting activities need not entail accepting this more radical view, which considers racial oppression as foundational for all European cultures. Secondly, as a European living in Europe myself, I don't see the term European as primarily a term of racial designation. I don't see it as a term of racial designation at all, to be honest. But in America, it's very different. And this is very much a point that's come from American society. I would say here, to say I am European does not immediately mean I am white. I am different to Black people. That's not what the term means here. This is an American interpretation being brought into how we interpret Bonhoeffer. So it is not only extremely difficult to bring the full effect of someone's personality to bear on contemporary issues. When doing so, we need to be aware that we are going beyond the text and engaging in a measure of speculation. Thinking in the spirit of Bonhoeffer, if you will. Being aware of this should mean being attentive to the differing contexts at play between then and now, and between what is distinctive to the American as opposed to the German or indeed the British experiences. Now, all this brings me finally to Christian nationalism. On this front, there is surely one truth which has to be held as primary to all other truths about Bonhoeffer's theology. Jesus Christ is the human being par excellence, universal humanity itself embodied as a divine person, and as such in him there is no Jew or Greek or black or white, and so on. As he puts it himself, only because God became human is it possible to know and not despise human beings. Real human beings may live before God, and we may let these real people live beside us and before God without either despising or idolizing them. This is not because of the real human being's inherent value, but because God has loved and taken on the real human being. Our living as real human beings and loving the real people next to us is grounded only in God's becoming human, in the unfathomable love of God for us human beings. And when he says it's possible to know and not despise human beings, we could translate that in a way more connected with today's context in terms of not being hateful towards other people. It's possible for us to live without hate because God has borne human nature. Moreover, Bonhoeffer was allergic to any attempts to reduce the New Testament to alignment with a particular ideology, because ideologies are human constructs grounded in the realm of ideas, whereas God's revelation in Christ is a concrete actuality which grounds its own truth on God himself. We can only respond in faith or not at all, as he puts it. No one can pray for the kingdom of God who imagines himself in bold utopias, in dreams and hopes of the kingdom, who lives in his ideologies, who knows thousands of programs and prescriptions with which to heal the world. We should look at ourselves very carefully when we catch ourselves thinking such thoughts. All our longing to transform the cursed field into a blessed one fails, because it is God who cursed the ground, and it is God alone who can bless the earth again. Bonhoeffer's rebuke against the so-called Deutsche Christen is at least partly about their blurring of these boundaries. They're making political positions coextensive with God's own truth, even when the Holy Bible says the opposite. It's the pseudo-religious character of Nazism that so appalled Bonhoeffer early on, making Hitler into a pseudo-messiah and the folk into some sort of vehicle of God. Some variants of Christian nationalism take on a religious or pseudo-religious character. I have in mind particularly here those groups who hold that the founding of the USA is predicted in the Bible as a decisive moment in the triumph of good over evil. There are such people. And that the USA has a unique eschatological role in history. Whenever a particular place or a particular people are mistaken for having a supreme role in Christ's redemption of the world, we are on very, very difficult territory. That said, however, if wanting to think in the spirit of Bonhoeffer, we do need to think what is meant by this term Christian nationalism. If we're talking about the deification of the American experience as having some sort of salvific role for humanity at large, every red flag imaginable should be raised. If we mean reasonable discussion of the degree to which Christians might want Christian teachings to be embedded in a constitutional settlement to foster the common good, that's very different. One definition I've seen describes Christian nationalists as those who, quote, claim the US is founded upon Christian ideas and that the country's current laws ought to reflect those beliefs. Well, I don't think Bonhoeffer would necessarily disagree with this, at least without some more information on what that actually means in practice. Moreover, a similar position is the de jure basis of the British Constitution. It's supposed to be, on paper, founded on Christian teachings and have laws which reflect those beliefs. I'm going to finish by discussing one of Bonhoeffer's, what I call his little cameo appearances in American Christian nationalism, with a view to opening up discussion on how he's being used. The source text is a highly controversial document called Project 2025, drawn up by right-wing think tanks last year to plan for the full-scale radical right reform in the USA, in the event of a second Trump presidency. Needless to say, concerns about uncontrolled mass migration feature heavily in the document. The position it takes is that migration needs to be controlled, so entrants are subject to legal checks, and that the numbers are limited wherever necessary for reasons of economic benefit and social and cultural cohesion. The foreword to the document mentions Bonhoeffer in relation to this, using Bonhoeffer as a foil against opponents of the document's position, whom it calls open borders activists. These activists are those opposed to controlling the levels of migration on the basis of what we might term radical compassion, or in a Christian context, love of neighbour. The point being made in that document is that the people most likely to favour uncontrolled immigration are those who do not live in poorer areas of the country and who have a level of material privilege, which means they are not in bitter competition for affordable housing, nor for education and healthcare. The people who are voting Republican, it says, are those who are, by contrast, on the front line when it comes to such competition. The document thus claims that practicing radical compassion or love of neighbour without any sacrificial impact on oneself is an example of what Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace. Costly grace, by contrast, comes at a price, and it is thereby real grace, not superficial holiness. Now, I think it goes without saying that this goes far beyond how Bonhoeffer describes cheap grace. It's not something that could be used in a political context, and it's not something that could be applied to this situation unless open borders activists felt that they were likely to receive divine grace by letting people into the country, which is clearly not what drives the migration debate. But what I found really interesting by looking this up and analysing how Bonhoeffer is being used is how little discussion there's been of exactly this type of argument and why it's wrong. What people will do will say, Bonhoeffer's in Project 2025. This is awful, let's do a statement about how awful this is. And what I would like to see a lot more of is that sort of detailed engagement with what's being claimed, why it's being claimed, how it aligns with texts Bonhoeffer himself has written, and how we might then work from that to think in the spirit of Bonhoeffer, which is exactly the way that I think, I'll do it myself now, exactly the way I think Bonhoeffer himself would have engaged with these realities. He would actually look at them deeply, discuss them, read the sources, and argue about them. And the problem is that when people are throwing words like fascist or Nazi around, the argument stopped because it's already been decided and turned into black and white terms. And it is something I see, unfortunately, happening on both sides. Thank you.
Wonder, if we sit and speak with each other, is it audible? Or do we need to pass the microphone? Okay. Shall we speak together? Of this.
This is actually the pick up for the sound. We can lower this. Start talking.
Okay, let's have a bit of conversation among each other before we open up to questions from the audience. Sorry. And first of all, thank you both very much for preparing so immensely well and bringing some depth into your short presentations and not shying away from having an opinion. I had the exhilarating experience of learning new things, which is wonderful. First of all, I wonder whether you'd like to ask each other something.
I'm sure I will, if I just think about it for a moment.
Eleanor, do you have a question for Jacob?
We spoke a little bit about this yesterday. I guess it's not a specific question, more asking you to reflect further on this incremental politicization of theology that you see in the US. And the comment that you made at the end about the lack of sustained engagement with sources, leaping to conclusions, making bold statements which aren't substantiated necessarily. Do you see those things as running parallel or kind of informing each other in cultural debate and practice? Or do you think they just, they're both components of this move that we're seeing and they don't actually relate to each other?
Yeah, I suppose, I think they're mutually perpetuating things. They happen in tandem. Sure, yeah, okay. I was saying I think that these two factors Eleanor mentioned are mutually perpetuating. They foster each other.
Now try talking.
How's that? Is that better? Okay. And a big thing I didn't talk about here for reasons of space is the internet and things being done online. Now, the way social media and online communication works, as we probably all know, people tend to communicate more with people they agree with. We have the phenomenon of what are called echo chambers, where everybody's in circles that they agree with. Algorithms perpetuate this. They're an incredible system with great potential for social control, ultimately, because algorithms can direct people into different ways of thinking and exposure to different sources and ideas. So there's an extrematization, if that's a word, on both sides as well, where the sober, calm and sober, reasoned interpretation of texts gets lost. And there's an expansion of what's acceptable to be said, which can be seen very obviously in political discourse on the right. But I noticed it in academia as well, on what Americans would call the left, which means something slightly different in America, I think. But you know, I was surprised to see people claiming communism as an identity in academic conferences. That was, when I first heard that, it was quite a surprise, because I've never heard it before. Communism was associated in my mind with the USSR and 1989 and everything else. And all of a sudden there were young Americans adopting this identity, which was associated with, you know, grave issues in the 20th century. So yeah, I think the two things perpetuate each other, and I think the internet has a lot to do with this taking on a quite extreme variance, which I see getting worse all the time, if I'm honest. I'm being quite pessimistic. People are getting more and more extreme all the time at the moment.
Do you have a remedy based on perhaps reading of Bonhoeffer or your theological engagement?
I wouldn't feel confident in saying I have a remedy. It sounds trite, but as a person of faith, there must be cause for hope in that a significant number of these people on both sides are Christian and are engaging in prayer and liturgy and reading the Bible. That must be a cause for hope. We don't see much of that hope yet. What I have seen in the Catholic world as a Catholic theologian is I've seen people becoming a bit less gung-ho as things have developed, and noticing when things are going beyond what's can be called recognisably Christian. I've seen that begin. So maybe it could be something that corrects itself in time. Prayer and Christian faith and belief in Jesus, one we would hope would have that correcting influence.
In Life Together, Bonhoeffer recommends singing in unison, listening to the other. Yeah, Eleanor.
No, I think they're struggling to hear. So.
Oh, sorry.
Right, we can. Can I take the microphone and pass it around? Okay, very good.
Yeah, when you were asking about possible, I think solutions is too strong, but possible avenues of trying to combat the kind of jumping to conclusions and just saying an opinion really loudly. I think part of the job of the academy is to be really clear on what is valuable within the academy, and some of that is what Jacob is talking about, which is diligent dealing with difficult texts. And just at lunch yesterday in college, one of the students said to me, "Oh, I've actually been able to sit down and read." It happened to be Life Together, but I've been able to sit down and read a whole book over the last 3 days. And I probably shouldn't say this to a tutor, but it's the first time I've done that in a very long time. Because there's pressures of assignment deadlines, and they're doing this and that and the other and looking after their families, and of course their time is pressed. But we have to be really clear what you're there to do when you're studying theology is to engage with really difficult texts in detail, and I think that sometimes we don't allow the time for that to happen properly, or we don't we stop expecting it because we see people able to show good argumentation in the assignments, and so we just kind of reward them for that. And I think a kind of, I'm sounding so old-fashioned, which I don't kind of really think that I am in lots of ways, but I do think that a return to really careful deliberation and an encouragement for friendly debate about what everyone has just read would really help, just in small contexts in practice and in churches as well.
So I do have a question now, Chloe, actually. Well, have you noticed the way that students think themselves as young people who have been exposed often to lots of ideas about theology and religion online? Do you sometimes get that sense when you're teaching at all that people have preconceived ideas about the things you're talking about?
My demographic is older. Yeah, so I have some students who are in their 20s, but they're really in the minority. So yeah, I think the engagement with social media possibly doesn't play out to the extent that it does with your demographic.
Yeah, let's check five more minutes and then we can go to the audience. The role of the church, I'd like to think about this a bit because I was struck in my reading Bonhoeffer again, that he was vexed by the question. It was his PhD thesis, it was life together, and it carried on what is this church to be and what can Christian community look like. And in terms of the role of churches, I mean, in Germany, we're currently in a phase where everyone calls the other one Nazi. I mean, that's the debate at the moment, really. And the bishops recently sent a very urgent letter accusing the centre-right Christian Democratic Party of basically being unethical and unchristian, because the church at some point has decided they know what is good about immigration, and everything outside of this seems to be off what is able to be discussed. And I think, isn't there something about an addiction to relevance, an addiction to wanting to be good, wanting to be important? Whereas I think what Bonhoeffer probably recommended to the church is give up on trying to be relevant to people. So, question, role of the church, what does the church look like in a climate that you rightly describe as Weimar-esque? I think that is fair to say. And a church that is a church without reassurances, that relies on Christ.
Well, I think the church should be of great value insofar as the church, due to its longevity and ultimately its divine founding, should quite naturally take the role as an awkward obstacle to that way of thinking. We simply won't be caught in falling sharply into one camp or another. I think that's something I see churches doing on occasion. I mean, I mentioned briefly as a Catholic, people really struggle with the current Pope because he has allegiances on both sides that I was laying out there. So in America, he's unanimously disliked, really, and he's really punished the American bishops in many ways because Americans can't understand him, because he's spoken out on issues which connect with both sides. So I think in that way, the church should sort of be able to cut through it. And I'm reminded of a passage in Ethics where Bonhoeffer makes a really intriguing statement about Jesus and the Pharisees, when he says, when the Pharisees ask him a question, they're trying to catch him in a situation where either answer he could possibly give would expose him as false or turn the people against him. And Jesus always manages to answer in such a way that he doesn't get snared in the trap the Pharisees have set for him And what really intrigues me is that Bonhoeffer says Jesus doesn't understand the question, which is really interesting, the naivety to Jesus, where he can't actually see what people are trying to do. He's just answering from a position of such sincerity and honesty. He just cuts through the division. So it'd be nice to think the church could be a bit like that.
Yeah, and I was thinking of a bit of ethics as well, where Bonhoeffer is talking about this very question, the relationship between the church and the state and how we should act towards one another. And he describes what he would like to see as, I forget the exact words, but it's something like a polemical dialogue or something like that, polemical conversation, where each side corrects, upbraids the other, but it's a continuous, I don't know, maybe spiral would be the best shape to use to describe it. And so from that perspective, he's clearly anticipating that both will have something to say, but that in the ideal situation, which we then have to kind of, downgrade our expectations for not being in the ideal situation, but in an ideal situation, both have something of value to say to each other. And the listening that has to be done on both sides also plays a major role in that relationship. Yeah, as to a more concrete answer, I'm afraid I don't know, but I think a simple obedience stance, which Jacob is pointing to there in the characterization that Bonhoeffer gives of Jesus, is a helpful place to start. Yeah.
The religion is Christianity. You say a lot of the co-opting is based on a misunderstanding of what Bonhoeffer means by religion. I haven't understood it myself so far, so could you enlighten me?
On the definition of religion as Christianity.
As in, what does Bonhoeffer refer to as religion there?
So he uses the term religion in a number of different ways, which, as we've seen in fragmentary texts, also makes it harder to unpick. Sometimes what he is meaning is, I think the most helpful definition that he gives is when he talks about the homo religiosus, the man of religion, the religious man. And he describes that person as someone who looks to God, and the God that person looks to is outside of the world, totally transcendent, totally separate to the world in which we live. And the religious person's instinct is to look up to God and seek from that God some kind of immediate response, saving action, problem solving, and that's where that word that we also get, the problem solving God and stopgap God, those terms come up as well in this context. And Bonhoeffer's problem with that attitude is that he wants people to be engaged in the world and to look at the world, engage responsibly with it, because, as he explains in his ethics, in the Christ event, the world and God become united in the person of Christ. And so, of course, if you believe that that has happened, by looking at the world, you will be able to discern something also of God. He's not a panentheist, but he's saying because of that unifying moment in Christ of God and the world, the Christian needs to pay attention to the world in which God has done something radical, and to cease looking, if you like, upwards and beyond to this God of the religious person who is essentially just a helper who can get called upon to come and sort everything out. And so in religionless Christianity, my understanding of it is that it's that religiosity that he's trying to get rid of, and encouraging instead people to engage with the world and see that as their theological task and the task of the Christian. Does that help?
Yes, that's
That was all. Thank you.
okay. Yes, that's good. So,
Hello. Greetings from Canada, and I just have a question for the speakers, and thank you for the wonderful talk. The misuse of Bonhoeffer's legacy in North America is well documented, and you summarized it well in the talks. My question to you is, knowing that the landscape between politics and religion is different in the UK and in Europe, but with the rise of right-wing parties in popularity, do you see this misuse of Bonhoeffer's legacy in the UK and Europe? Thank you.
So I should admit at this point that I have not reflected on this enough. There's no obvious example to me in the English context of people appealing to Bonhoeffer for a particularly, for a nationalist agenda. More widely, I know that in the statement that Bonhoeffer's family made in the wake of the film, that they referred to a specific abuse of Bonhoeffer's thoughts in the German context, but I don't know enough about that to comment, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any use of Bonhoeffer. There is a small occasional tendency of some on the extreme populist right to claim to be Christian and to use to have crosses on demonstrations and things like that. This sort of anti-Islamic movement, as it were, has done that a bit. It's all a bit. It's all very different here because there are far fewer Christians. Christianity has a much less vocal role to play in public life than it does in the USA. And it's always a bit more complex when those right-wing populists use Christianity because it gets caught up in whether it's Protestant or Catholic as well, strangely. And that animosity doesn't exist in the same way in the USA. There are Catholic and Protestant Christian nationalists. There are two variants of it. But here it tends to get closely linked with a sort of nationalist, sort of Ulster-esque Protestantism as well. So it's not, it can't have a groundswell of support. But as for Bonhoeffer in relation to that, I'm not aware of any use.
Yeah. Okay. There's a letter from. No, it's not
going to work. It's not going to work.
I just.
Yeah. I was struck once by a letter from Bonhoeffer to his fiancée Maria von Wegenmeier, who was at that time at her parents' and mother's place, not so far, but Bonhoeffer was at the time. And the mother was involved in the Berneuschner movement. I don't know whether you know about the Berneuschner movement. The brother was Michael, so they were basically from after the First World War, they tried to find a new way of Christianity in Germany, and they were very much involved in meditation, bringing back meditation and prayer, and going inwards. But they were also then, after 33, part of them were members of the Confessing Church as well. But only for writes to Maria that be aware of those people, because they exactly what you said about religion, maybe understanding religion, they don't do anything, they're not active, they're just going inwards, and they are those are the people we cannot really trust, and don't go with those people, which I found always striking, and somehow I didn't understand where that comes from. So because it's precisely a kind of splitting, and even people who are close to him in the confessing church, then you can't trust them. So what is the idea of activity? And you said at the beginning, it's about not love, not here, but first listen to God, and then it will tell you what you do in the world. And they were doing that, but he was warning them. So maybe you can help me with that. I'm confused why it's not suspicious of this group.
Connected with the famous quote, you can't sing Gregorian chant if you don't shout for the Jews at the same time, which the two of us like singing Gregorian Vespers in the tradition of this. So yeah, hear the tension. Different idea.
Yeah, he's very suspicious of inwardness in general. There are lots of mentions of inwardness throughout his writing that he kind of says, no, don't get caught into all of this weird stuff. I don't know enough about, of course, it's what makes this particularly interesting, right, is that his father is a psychiatrist, and I haven't yet read a kind of compelling, or to me at least, really clear explanation of anyone who kind of says, and the fact that Carl was a psychiatrist impacted Dietrich in this particular way, which made him then really wary of inwardness. But I think there must be something that is going on there. But I think that the suspicion around inwardness being coupled with a lack of action in the world is really where he starts feeling very agitated. And yes, there is that call to be focused on God, that call to this phrase, simple obedience. But there's also in discipleship this idea of hidden righteousness, which is that your life as a disciple should come so naturally to you because it becomes so ingrained in who you are that you don't even realize that that is what you're doing. You're simply being. You're being. His emphasis on worldliness comes a bit later in his writing, but you can kind of see it happening in discipleship. You are in the world. You're being a responsible person as Christ is the exemplar of responsibility. And you don't need to reflect on how great a disciple you're being, and you don't have to kind of pat yourself on the back for how holy you are, because it's so ingrained in who you are that you just be, you just do the thing. And all those ideas coalesce around this real suspicion of the inward life. And there's a compelling letter written from prison where he says something like, even one's personal salvation has now become irrelevant. All we can think about is to try to do the will of God. And that's so striking. He's completely thrown away. Of course he's praying, of course he's reading his Bible, but he can't let the question of his own salvation preoccupy him when so much more is at stake, which is a really striking phrase.
Yes, very much so. I think it connects with cheap grace as well, the proper understanding of cheap grace. Insofar as when he discusses cheap grace versus costly grace, cheap grace applies to those who can find religious consolation as a justification for not acting. At moments where they are called to act by God on behalf of the welfare of other people. And his seems to be have in mind his co-religionists who have not joined the confessing church, but whom he knows deep down probably agree with them, but can tell themselves we're not saved through works, we're saved by faith. And I can find consolation in that from scripture and in prayer. And how I respond to the demands of the world makes me I'm not decisive for my salvation, because that's what Luther taught. And he says within that discussion of cheap grace and costly grace that Luther left the monastery and came out into the world. This is now reversed for us. We have to leave the world, not leave worldliness, but we have to retreat back to the monastery to get to the core of what Luther was saying. And costly grace is embarking on those sacrificial and very painful actions on behalf of other people, being a recipient of divine grace subsequent to that, but in such a way that the act itself is not salvific, it doesn't undermine what Luther actually said himself. Although it says it creates the conditions whereby grace is possible, when there's a cost, but the cost itself doesn't buy the grace. If that makes sense.
By what to judge the necessity to act is my question. I'm suspicious of activism because my personal take is that we're surrounded by cultural activism. If in doubt, join a demonstration, sign a petition, not join a party that's already too complicated, but have an opinion, express it quickly. What helps you discern what a righteous, graceful call to action is as compared to cheap activism?
It's really the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? When I focused on the book Discipleship on our PhD, and it just has these open passages which are incredibly compelling and exciting and stimulating. So just do what Christ commands you to do it right now. And you're thinking, great, what do I do? So it's very difficult. I mean, I always felt I saw something with the Spirit of Bonhoeffer in things like there's a wonderful soup kitchen there where I used to live, where the people that have just volunteered there for years every Sunday, and it's difficult. People there are very difficult. They often have addiction problems, mental health problems. There is a huge amount of personal sacrifice involved. I always felt I saw something of Bonhoeffer and what those people did. And I think that's I forgot another point, but it'll come back to me.
Sorry, I also wanted to say that.
I'll just add a quick something while you remember your thought. It's more of a way to not answer the question, which may or may not be helpful. But I think that Bonhoeffer would certainly want to reject any application of any principle by which you would be able to work out what you should be doing and when you should start acting and beyond what point you should go. And if we could briefly return to the film, one of the things that the character Bonhoeffer says in that film, which I thought, oh, that's a bit, not comfortable with that, is he goes back to New York in 1939, and which is totally accurate, and he's depicting as giving a kind of trial sermon or trial speech in front of his friend Albert Franklin Fisher, and in that trial sermon, practice sermon, he says, how far are you prepared to go? Or how far will you go? And I don't think that that's the way in which he thought of this at all. It was much more, frustratingly for his readers, nebulous, but more of a kind of, I'm following Christ and it will lead where it leads. But a rejection of any kind of principle that could be applied to work this out. Yeah.
I remember my other point. I don't know if it was worth the wait, but I was going to say on activism, it would have to be about what the real earthly consequences are of acting as well. a lot of activism is about identity and belonging and performance, and less about the ultimate tangible benefits, which are really focused on action on behalf of whoever it is one enacting. And Bonhoeffer also draws attention to where Christ said that everyone must take up their cross and follow him. And there's another wonderful passage in discipleship where he says everybody has their own cross. It's tailor-made, bespoke, it's made to fit. You have your own cross. And I think that can look very different in each case. And for some people it could be a caring commitment or something like that. But one of the problems with the taxes, one of the many problems, is this idea that the core that Bonhoeffer was talking about is some kind of massive act of often attention-seeking, media-savvy, sort of political quote-unquote martyrdom. Whereas I think I know people have found solace in Bonhoeffer for very quiet, domestic situations of intense sacrifice.
When you speak of Bonhoeffer's uneasy tensions, right? He denounces meditation and psalm singing, but then he writes Life Together. And I know of someone who was in Finkenwalde and said, it was so straight. I had to meditate and sing psalms all the time. You know, I think for a church justified by being part of the struggle for listening to Christ, it then was okay to have religious practice. It was sort of justified by listening to the call. In fact, the ability to hold tensions is perhaps one of the things that we ought to perhaps be inspired by through our Christology, because what is the biggest tension? And you're both fully human and divine. Are there any other questions? Don't be sure.
Just thinking about film, do you think it's inevitable, given the complexity of Bonhoeffer's life and film, that any film doesn't make it too simple, too simplistic? It's possible, in theory, to make a film that actually doing justice. Could you repeat the question?
So the question is whether there could be any film ever made that would do justice to Bonhoeffer, given the complexity and the uneasy tensions.
Probably not, but then I think that's true of many people. I'm thinking of films where it's done quite well, like Gandhi. There's a brilliant 1980s film about Gandhi, which is very good. No, I think it would have to be more of a very, very long documentary. A sort of 6-hour long documentary with lots of theological discussion. Not many people would enjoy it, but they
Yeah, or the alternative for a film might be a moment of his life, or just a couple of years of the story, but that might not be very compelling either.
Finkenwalde, yeah. How to be strict with ordinance. Yes, that would be good for Constantine.
When listening to your description of his ethics, you were talking about discipleship, it struck me that it's very similar to virtue ethics. So was he really influenced by Aristotle's philosophy of ethics? Is that where he got his ethics from, essentially?
Well, there is a book, and I'm embarrassed because I've forgotten the name of the author. Is it Jennifer Mobley who wrote that book, Bonhoeffer the Virtue Ethicist, or Bonhoeffer and Virtue Ethics? Anyway, there's a scholar, a British Bonhoeffer scholar, who quite a while ago wrote basically making the argument that he is in fact a virtue ethicist. I think the reason why I wouldn't go quite that far is that in virtue ethics, the perennial problem is who gets to decide what a virtue is. You can be in a community who have decided on their set of virtues that they want to pursue, or you can be Aristotle and you can have the golden mean, and that's how you decide what your virtues are and what your vices are. But you could then, if you're in one community, you can go to another community, and their virtues might actually be quite different to your community's set of virtues. And I think for Bonhoeffer, there's no such relativism, because he's so Christologically orientated that he can't swap one set of virtues for another. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I haven't read Mobley's book. I think I'm interested in those links, although I haven't read the book, because I know when Bonhoeffer was writing ethics, he spent some time at the Benedictine monastery of Etam in Bavaria, and did read a bit of virtue ethics there, or some tones of which fascinates me. But my first reaction to it is one of slight unease, because I think the danger of virtue ethics, I think, in Bonhoeffer's mind would be when it's transparent to oneself what the virtuous thing to do is. So those opening lines to ethics, which Eleanor quoted there, suggesting that ethics is not about asking how can I be good or what's the right thing to do. Virtue ethics would seem often to need to evolve that question, and indeed have a measure of confidence that one has behaved as virtuously as you possibly could, which I think would make one more comfortable. But then you're in a very difficult situation of being asked to act and called to act without really almost being allowed to fully evaluate how one has acted.
What's the basis on?
Yeah.
What's the basis for that?
Yeah. And that's one of the things that's very challenging about Bonhoeffer's ethics. There's almost a kind of blindness or agnosticism toward the self that's required, because you're just sort of losing yourself in the world in the midst of life's struggles and the demands of other people, and not going away afterwards and thinking, well, I did that bit right, I did that bit wrong, or trusting that we're not being judged or evaluated in that way. Perhaps, my God.
In terms of the movie, you basically should read out books, right? But then nobody buys cinema tickets, which is difficult. But I wonder, of Bonhoeffer's writings, be that letters, be that sermons, be that academic writings, which one would you recommend to the people here and online and to the church and say, listen to this, read it, and inwardly digest it? Here the man speaks.
I would have to say discipleship. It's the first time I read discipleship, it was just, I had goosebumps, shivers down the spine with the power of the opening chapters, part 1 particularly. If you're reading it in English, I would also say, this is a bit controversial, but I'd say read the 1950s translation, because I think it might not be fully accurate, but it's got a wonderful way of it being expressed in the slightly antiquated English that I like as well. And I'd also say the Christology lectures, which we published as a separate book called Christ the Centre. There's just some wonderful passages in the opening of those lectures. They're quite obscure, they're quite difficult to find, but I just don't recommend.
I have to say Letters and Papers from Prison. I think for a foray into Bonhoeffer, they are accessible because they're letters, and so because otherwise I might say ethics, but that's just such a massive tome that you just get depressed after 3 pages and just move on to something else. But Letters and Papers is just from a readerly perspective. Some of them are quite chatty. You get the letters back to him from his family members and his friends and colleagues, and so it lulls you into a false sense of security where you kind of think, oh, this is quite a a nice easy read, and I'm, able to follow along, and then suddenly he just slams you with a really outrageous theological suggestion, and you kind of have to go along with him. And so I really like that book for that reason, and that he is extremely challenging in it. And you also, if you read Letters and Papers from Prison, the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works in English version contains some of his poetry as well, which I think is also a really important aspect in his late work. And otherwise, maybe Life Together would be my second choice. Yeah, thinking about living in community and how, maybe interestingly for this community, for this debate today, when he's outlining different types of community, one that is bound together by seeing each member of the community through Christ, so then being able to see the other as Christ sees that person. And he opposes that to the kind of community in which people are trying to just get control over the person that they're with and trying to make them be the person that they want them to be without allowing them to be who they are in Christ. And maybe that type of coercion and type of manipulation that Bonhoeffer points to there is also something to reflect on in the current climate.
The prison letters have in them. No, that's not the prison letters. That's the letters to his fiancée, right? The famous hymn, Von guten Mächten.
I think that's in Letters and Papers.
That is in Letters and Papers. And it is in such incredible tension with the content of the Letters and Papers, which calls for radical abandonment of religious hope and letting God die in you. And then he writes this hymn and invokes heavenly consolation through transcendent forces that surround us miraculously. Wolfgang hated that. He wrote a whole paper trying to explain away the miraculous powers that surround us and comfort us. He found it impossible. It kind of moves me. It, I think, shows that he could hold an incredible tension in which consolation and a transcendent world coexist with complete and utter abandonment on the cross. Any more questions? I think it's time. Anybody online? We'll wrap things up, so we go.
I don't rap. Yeah, I'm going to make a full sermon now. I was really inspired. Thank you so much. As a German pastor who studied theology for 7 years and had ethics as one part of my exam, it was really, for me, extremely interesting to listen to theology tonight, because we don't do that so often, unfortunately. And I think it has a lot to say. And I came to UK, I found it to be astonishing how much Bonhoeffer is regulated here, and also, well, put on a context, which is a bit weird for me, I must say. But still, I like the way people are engaging in his theology, and this was a brilliant evening, I must say. And thank you so much, both of you, for giving all these enlightening, interesting thoughts. Before we invite you all to a glass of wine, water or juice and some snacks, I want to say thank you with some books, and I was not sure if you might have them, especially you, Jacob, because one of them is about the Bonhoeffer Church. If you already have it.
I think I do.
Okay, so that's good. So I have something, the German choir, German music, if you want to listen to that. And then 500 years German Protestants in Britain, a little book and 50 years of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Church. Thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very kind.
Thank you. To read.
Very much.